get into all of that and how this, like, how the hell did this happen, right? Why do all women, and really most people, why do people believe what they believe about feminism and gender equality, right? How did we get here? Because if you ask the average person on the street, they have some conception of it that goes like this. Prior to the 19th Amendment, which we passed in 1920, all women were very oppressed. They were slaves. They had no rights. They couldn't get educated. They couldn't do anything except be chained to the stove and forced to give birth and, cook meals for men. And they got beaten if they looked at a man wrong. And all these horrible things were legal. And so the women looked around and they said, oh, no, we're oppressed. We have to do something. And suddenly, for some reason, around the turn of the century, they start marching with signs and demanding rights until finally they get the right to vote. And then later they get birth control. And now they're trying to have careers and they can do anything a man can do. And this is what people think the history is. And the whole reason I wrote the book is because that's not at all how it happened. Not even close. So that's what we're going to get into in depth today. And hopefully we can unravel a lot of these bullshit myths that everyone believes are true because you've just heard them repeated.
Okay.
And why the myths are out there. So.
Okay, so where do you want to start?
Well, I'll start by saying that why is this important? Like you said, you feel this is important. Why is it important? It's because feminism is the greatest revolution of all time. I would say more than the technological revolution, the industrial revolution, the actual revolutionary period of the French and American Revolution. I think feminism trumps all of those. And the reason for that is it has changed everything about your world and your life in just 100 years. So we have many thousands of years of human history. And in just the last century, the entire social order and everything about the world has been completely inverted by feminism, by this women's liberation movement. Everything you know about your life, everything about the way your world works is affected by this one social revolution. So the way that families function, the way governments function, the way corporations function, the way day-to-day life is lived, the way we perceive ourselves, the way we have relationships with everyone we know, from friends to spouses to children, family, is all deeply, deeply affected by this one social revolution. And if it had been a grassroots movement that was born out of some need for freedom that women didn't have, that might be one thing. But when you go back and actually investigate, see what I do, I'm kind of like Jay Dyer, who's a good friend of mine. I go back and read all of the nerdy feminist writings from the 1800s and even further back than that, because nobody else wants to read that shit. It's horrible. It's garbage. It's boring. It's terrible. So this is why you should buy my book and support my work, because I had to sit here and read this crap for the last 5 years to help you all out with this. But if you go back and read the writings of feminists themselves, even the biggest ones that we all know, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you go back and read their writings. They say themselves in the history of women's suffrage that the biggest obstacle to women's liberation was women. Women did not want it. Not only did they not want it, it was so deeply unpopular. Like here in the United States, for example, when they were trying to pass suffrage laws, they actually had some referendums in multiple states. Massachusetts, I think, was the biggest one. So they actually put on the ballot for women, would you like to have the right to vote on the ballot? Do you even want the right to vote? And for all the women that bothered to come out and vote, only 4% of them wanted suffrage. 4% of women wanted suffrage. So you know what they did? The National Association of Women's Suffrage blocked all further referendums and said women cannot have the right to vote about whether they want the right to vote.
That's great.
Who knows that, right? Do you get taught that in high school? If you go to your women's studies program, do you ever hear about that? No, you don't. There's also a wonderful professor named Joe C. Miller who did a really extensive study of all the women's history textbooks that are in the biggest colleges in the United States from around 1920 until the late 1990s. And what he found is that they gradually over time edited out all the parts of this history that I'm about to go over with you guys and explain, and they changed it. And this really started in 1970 with the founding of the women's studies departments in the big universities, which was funded by the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. All the tinfoil hat folks out there probably already know about the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations and some of the shenanigans that they're up to. But of course, they funded this and created this as an academic discipline. And so they are the gatekeepers of the history. And so they have sanitized it, they've whitewashed it, and they have turned it into a history that is, of course, beneficial to this feminist ethos. Why? Because who the hell goes to become a women's studies professor besides someone who is already convinced and like a militant feminist, right? Those are the only people who want to become a women's studies professor. So the history has been co-opted, gatekept, whitewashed into this thing that we all hear, that women were oppressed and enslaved and the evil patriarchy just wanted to keep its boot on women's throats until, you know, the good feminists came along and liberated everyone. So that's the reason why we have this false view of history. But yeah, I think it's super important. And I think the first step to untangling this god-awful mess we're in is letting people know that what you think you know about feminism isn't true at all. About where this starts. So my book starts back in ancient times, because this goes all the way back to the beginning of human existence, where, if you guys recall, in your Bible, you had Adam and Eve, right? But what a lot of people maybe are less familiar with, that feminists love, is an entity called Lilith. Are you guys familiar with Lilith?
Yep.
Okay, so she is kind of a myth that comes out of, you know, early Kabbalah and some other kind of esoteric traditions, where she's rumored to be the first wife of Adam that refused to submit. She refused to be under him when they were, you know, doing the thing. And so she would not get under him. So she flew off into the sea and rebelled, and they tried to make a deal with her where they said, look, you have to come back and be Adam's wife. Otherwise, 100 of your demon babies, apparently she has these demon children that she creates somehow, they're going to die every day. So you have to come back. She wouldn't come back. And the legend is basically that she's this succubus demon that kills infants. And our words, I don't know what words we can say here.
You can say anything you want.
Okay. She basically rapes men in their sleep. She's like a succubus demon or an incubus demon that will rape you in your sleep if you're a man. So in the ancient world, they had all these protections against her. They'd put amulets over baby cribs, and men would be like really careful if they were sleeping in a house alone to not let Lilith in. And she's become, in modern times, like since the 70s, and especially lately with TikTok. If you guys haven't ever tried the hashtag witch talk, give it a shot if you want to go down a crazy rabbit hole of feminism. They love Lilith. They think Lilith is their hero. They hold her up as this like goddess figure of what they want to be, like this in permanent rebellion against men, right? And so even from ancient times, we have these myths like her. We have in Hinduism, they have the goddess Kali, who, by the way, was chosen to be on the cover of the first issue of Ms. Magazine. And we'll get into the founding of Ms. Magazine and who funded it and Gloria Steinem and all that stuff. But they put the Hindu goddess Kali on the cover of the 1972 debut issue of Ms. Magazine, which when I was researching, I thought, this is a very bizarre choice. If you're trying to sell a magazine to suburban American women in 1972, why would you put a blue-skinned, six-armed Hindu goddess on the cover, right? Seems weird. So I look into her and I immediately understood why. And the reason is because Kali is like this dark mother goddess in the Hindu religion who is a creator, but also a destroyer of worlds. And her consort Shiva, like her male counterpart, had to throw himself under her feet to keep her from destroying all of the world in a fit of like, you know, probably hormonal induced rage, I would guess. To snap her out of it. And she demanded this blood sacrifice of men, especially on the battlefield and things like this. And if you look it up in the Guinness Book of World Records, the most prolific serial killer cult in all of history is one of her cults called the Thuggies, which is where we get our English word thug. from. And for 800 years in India, this cult kind of ran wild and would kidnap people who were on trade routes and things like that and sacrifice them, but only men, because if you tried to sacrifice a woman, she would smite you out of existence. So they would particularly kill men and sacrifice them to Kali. So, of course, Gloria Steinem decides this is who we need on the cover of the first feminist magazine, right? This vengeful, man-hating kind of goddess that kind of tells you everything you need to know about what the feminist movement was about. So this is like a very ancient idea of women rebelling. And even in the Bible, it says in the curse, when Eve is given her curse, the serpent has to be crushed under the foot of humanity, and he has to crawl on his belly. Adam has to toil under the sun to provide sustenance for himself and his family. And Eve gets the curse that she's going to have to give childbirth in pain, and that she will always desire to kind of usurp her husband's authority and want to rule over him, but won't be able to. So this is like an ontological issue that we as women have, that we always want to, our desire is for our man. We want our man, but we also have this constant struggle to like lord over him instead of him being the leader of us. Totally. The way that we kind of got here is during the revolutionary period. So you might wonder, like, okay, we have maybe, depending on how you view it, 6,000 to 10,000 years of recorded human history. Why, if this started in the ancient world and that spirit was always there, this revolutionary spirit of woman and feminism was always there, why did it not saturate the culture the way it has until so recently? And I think it is because the Industrial Revolution and technology is what allows women to have this illusion that they don't need men. So where we see feminism really start to take off is during the French Revolution and the American Revolutionary period, with Mary Wollstonecraft, who writes A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in response to an English lord who had written Rights of Man, right? And so she writes this first feminist, widely publicated pamphlet. Now, this is another thing you guys are going to notice. We hear that women weren't allowed to do anything. They couldn't be educated. People think they couldn't go to school. They couldn't read. They couldn't do anything. That's all bullshit. Even in a lot of third world cultures, women had tons of rights and things that they could do. But in Western culture specifically, we'll just stick to that for the sake of brevity here. Women have been able to own businesses and own land and get educated and do all kinds of things throughout Western history. And I detail that in chapter 3 of my book. I take a whole chapter to kind of debunk this myth that women were never allowed to do anything, that there was some conspiracy of men to just keep women down so that they could be controlled and used for sex objects. It's completely untrue. Women owned land in ancient Greece. Women owned bars, taverns, all kinds of different businesses in England through the Middle Ages and things like that. So this idea that women could never do anything is baloney. And in America, since we have been keeping track, we started tracking these stats in 1790 of like high school graduation and literacy rates. And women have always outpaced men in literacy rates and high school graduation rates since 1790. Okay. So this idea that y'all have that women were not allowed to, that women weren't allowed to do anything is baloney. And why would that be? Well, it was very practical. And this is another recurring theme. There were reasons for these things. It wasn't just men wanted to keep women as sex slaves. There were like practical reasons for why things functioned the way they did for so many centuries and millennia, right? Because the men at 8th grade, it's like, okay, you need to go work on the farm, or you need to go to the factory, or you need to go fight on the front lines in a war. We didn't take a lot of extra time and effort to educate men in the academic realm because women were generally the ones who were at home teaching children how to read, write, and all that sort of thing before the public school system. And men would often be working and building the nation and defending the nation because that was their job. So no, there was never this like widespread oppression. Were there some Ivy League colleges who didn't let some women into some fields? Sure, but they also didn't let men in. This is something that is also widely misunderstood. Did you know that in England, men only gained universal suffrage 10 years before women did?
What?
Yeah, nobody ever tells you that. People have this idea that all men everywhere have always had all the power and all the rights. completely untrue. So there was no conception of people's rights until after the revolutionary period to begin with. You had monarchs and you had a feudal system and other similar types of systems throughout history. But we get to the period where we start instituting democratic nation states in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Most men could not vote either. You had to like own land. You had to be a certain age. It depended where you were, right? What the stipulations were. But it was like very restrictive, and only a certain percentage of men could vote until right before women got the vote. So that's one thing I think people should know. And that, yeah, women could own property and they could do all kinds of things. Now, you'll hear feminists say, but we couldn't have credit cards and bank accounts until the 70s. True. But why, right? Why? Well, the reason for this is that up until 1970, women couldn't be held legally liable for supporting their families or for debts. So women could go down to the department store, say in 1850, if you went down to Bloomingdale's when it was brand new in New York in the middle 1800s, and a wife wanted to rack up a little bit of a credit line, buy some dresses, buy some housewares, she would do it under her husband's name. So he would have a credit line at the store, and she'd be an authorized user on the account, and she could buy things, but the husband was the one legally held responsible. And if a woman in New York got divorced, I have an old pamphlet, like a flyer that they printed in the early 1900s that showed this, where the anti-suffrage groups who did not want women's liberation said, look, we have all these privileges under male suffrage that we don't want to lose. Right now, even if we enter a marriage as a wealthy woman and we marry a poor guy, he is still responsible for all the family debt, all the support of all the children. So if for some reason I do get a divorce, which was rare, but if I was granted a divorce, he's still going to have to pay for everything, and I can take all my money with me when I go. So this idea that women were just oppressed and had no rights is baloney. Women were allowed to work. Most of them just didn't work because it didn't make sense. If you had an average of 5 to 7 children per family in 1890, why would you have the woman go work and send all those kids off to a daycare? You'd never... Like the math doesn't math on that, right?
It's just so crazy. It's just so crazy that they were sold this like, oh, dude, you can work and you can pay taxes and you could be held accountable for your debt. Isn't that awesome? I'd be like, it's not.
Now we have a situation where women earn the majority of college degrees. They far outpace men in college attendance and getting
even when I went to school, that was it. I mean, that was a selling point at the college. Dude, it's 4 chicks to 1 guy. Yeah. I'm like, sign me up, dude. Let's go.
Right. So, but what comes with that is that women now hold the majority of college debt. So the average woman graduates from college with $40,000 in debt. That's only the average. A lot of them, it's a lot more. So we tell women to do this absolutely insane thing. And this is what happened to me. And this is how I started researching. This is kind of what got it going for me. I was always in like smarty pants kid programs in school. And I was told from kindergarten, you will go to college and you will have a career because that is what a successful woman does. And you're a smart girl. And this is what you need to do. Before you even think about getting married or having kids, go get your college degree and start your career. Then you can have kids. Okay, well, by the time I got done with high school, I had figured out that school was not for smart people, and it was not about learning. I had figured that out, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I even had a college scholarship that I turned down because another 4 years of that system, I was just like, no, absolutely not.
I am with you.
So I didn't do that, and I had my first child at 20, and everyone told me my life was over. They were like, oh, what a waste. Rachel's never going to do anything with all that brain power she has, and all her talents are just going to be wasted because she's just a mom. And I was like, do you want the dumb girls having all the babies? That doesn't make sense to me. You only want the like low IQ women to be having kids. You don't want the smart women reproducing. So I just ignored them. But, you know, I had my first daughter at 20, and everyone told me, you've got to go back to work. And I remember her only being like 3 or 4 weeks old and driving her to a daycare. And I'm in the car thinking, wait, so I'm going to take my daughter to some other random woman and pay half of what I make at my job, which I don't really care about now that I've had a baby. I'm going to pay half of what I make for some other woman to be her mom all day. And then I get to see her like 2 hours before I have to put her to bed and do this shit all over again. Why? So I can pay taxes, so I can pay daycare. This seems like a stupid, inefficient, dumb system. Who the hell came up with this? And that was kind of like the beginning of me starting to realize this is kind of a scam, and like, who came up with this, right? And then, a decade of research later, I find out all kinds of crazy stuff. But that's basically what we've done, is we've convinced women that motherhood is for losers.
I can't
and
believe
women
it.
Who can't hack it in the career world, and that what you really need to do is spend all your fertile years going to university and starting a career. And then all of a sudden, at the age of like 30, which is the average age a woman first gets married in this country now, and we're having babies on average for the first time at like 30, 31 years old, that you're suddenly going to flip a switch at 30 and become a homemaker. You're going to suddenly be a mom now, after you've spent your whole life up until that point grooming yourself to be a career woman. And we wonder why the birth rate is 1.6 kids per woman, and why every nation touched by feminism is well below replacement. Nursing, breastfeeding is very protective as far as like hormonal cancers.
Oh, wow.
And so back in the day before birth control, you might not get that many periods over the course of your lifetime, but it's because you were pregnant or you were nursing. And then generally when you would stop nursing, you'd get your period back and probably shortly thereafter get pregnant again. But that's a whole different thing than taking exogenous hormones starting when you're 15 or 16 years old and taking them your whole life, convincing your body that it's pregnant and no pregnancy ever comes. That's a whole different thing. And it does all kinds of things to women.
Well, they give them to women for acne, right? In their teenage years.
To regulate your periods, if you it's total baloney. This idea that 88% of all American women will be on birth control at some point in their lifetime. So, and by the way, this research for the birth control pill came out of partially a desire to figure out if we can swap genders. This research that was being done at Hirschfeld's clinic of trying to turn men into women, turn women into men, they were creating exogenous hormones and seeing if they could gender swap. And they figured out that it could make people infertile. And so that's kind of where the birth control pill comes from. And they thought this would be a great depopulation tool. So that's why the Rockefellers funded it.
Unbelievable.
What happened? So we have this major revolution happen like in 1970s. You have women's studies departments being created and funded and put in every major university in the country. You have this massive recruitment propaganda telling all the high school girls that they need to go to universities, they need to go to college. And once they're on a college campus, do you guys remember Kent State? Do you remember all of the Roe versus Wade propaganda?
Yeah.
Right? So it's not by accident. This stuff didn't all happen at the same time by accident. It was on purpose because they wanted to make abortion legal, because they'd already done that in Russia with devastating results on the birth rate there. So they knew that worked. The birth control pill was legalized in 1965, and they couldn't get women to vote. So this is another thing people don't know. Women have had the vote since 1920 in the United States. Almost no women voted for like the first 30 years.
Women don't vote now. They really don't vote.
Now they are the biggest voting bloc.
Oh, snap.
This just changed. Well, it just changed. So this is new. Women weren't voting until they created women's studies departments in 1970 and pushed all the women into the workforce and the universities. We had the largest change, I think, was when during the decade of the 1970s, we went from having only, I'm looking at my notes here. Only 6% of children under the age of 6 had full-time working moms in 1940. By 2013, that number became 58%.
Wow.
And in the 70s, women just entered the workforce in huge numbers, and there was a lot of TV sitcoms. What was that big sitcom? Mary
Tyler Moore Show?
Mary Tyler Moore Show, right? Pushing this like career woman thing, Dolly Parton in 9 to 5. There's all this propaganda that came out in the 70s, the Stepford Wives movie. There was tons of cultural propaganda pushing women into the workforce, convincing them that being a suburban housewife was hell on earth. It was you're killing your soul. You have to be free. You have to go find yourself. Right?
Go work is freedom, dude. Think about that. Think about that.
My oldest daughter is 23, and when she was 21, I distinctly remember her calling me one day and going, "Mom," she's like, "I get it now. Working sucks. Why did they tell us this was awesome? What were we thinking?"
It
she was
sucks.
just like, "This sucks." Yeah. So we had this huge shift in the 70s, and it was because of women's studies programs. It was because of Roe v. Wade. It was because of this massive propaganda campaign in music, in movies, in TV shows, in magazines, telling women, and this is what we have right now. You cannot name a single female pop star who doesn't promote women's sexual liberation and strong independent woman stuff. You got Taylor Swift, you got Beyonce, all these female, Cardi B, Megan Thee Stallion. It's like, I'm a dude. I can rack up bodies like a dude. I can go through 34 boyfriends and I can be sexually liberated. I can be a boss bitch and I've got all this money and I can pay my own bills and I don't need a man. This stuff got pushed, all through my childhood in the 80s and 90s. I grew up with She-Ra and, all of the strong independent woman stuff too. And being told that this is what I had to do. But this was Steinem's job. This is what her job through the CIA was to do that. And it was not unrelated to their MK Ultra program. So I'm sure you guys probably know about MK Ultra. I've done tons of study. Other than feminism, MK Ultra I've probably done the most research on. And part of MK Ultra, it was basically a research program to figure out how do we brainwash people, how do we sway. Other than feminism, MK Ultra I've probably done the most research on. And part of MK Ultra, it was basically a research program to figure out how do we brainwash people, how do we sway public opinion, by what means can we do mind control on a mass scale. And so part of MK Ultra was actually, the government is the one that kind of pushed LSD and disseminated it through the Grateful Dead, and Timothy Leary, and also through Terence McKenna. And he was important to this because he was pushing psychedelics, DMT, LSD, mushrooms, and goddess worship. So he would say, he would go around to universities giving speeches, and he's another guy that the CIA got him because he got himself in trouble. He got caught with drugs trying to cross a border. He got arrested, and they said, look, you can either spend a whole bunch of time in prison or you can come work for the CIA and push psychedelics on the culture and this sort of thing.
Damn!
Straightforward, too.
Yeah. Yeah. So Terence McKenna spends the 80s and, most of the 70s and 80s pushing DMT, talking about the DMT elves and how we need to worship the goddess and return to the goddess. And this was a big influence, especially in those kind of cultures, this goddess worship stuff. And we've seen now in the United States, the last I checked when I wrote the book, Wicca and various forms of witchcraft are the fastest growing religion in the United States, because they've been pushing this Mother Earth worship, veganism, psychedelics. Now, I'm not saying that there might not be applications for psychedelics. I know there's people who are big fans of it. I'm not saying that there might not be some applications for that. But what I am saying is if the CIA is pushing it and telling you need to go talk to the DMT elves, which are going to tell you to worship the goddess, you might just have a problem and you might just want to think about that. That's all I'm trying to say. Because they're not pushing this stuff because they love you and care about you. They want to know, how do we brainwash you, control you, and manipulate you so that we can, do whatever nefarious stuff we have going on. Yeah. So, the CIA was a big part of making this stuff mainstream through Ms. Magazine, through all of these. The CIA has its own budget for film and TV to disseminate propaganda and things of that nature, too. And just feminism was a huge part of it. You couldn't have the transgender phenomenon you have right now if you didn't push feminism first. Couldn't have it. because you have Margaret Fuller was writing about gender as a spectrum and gender abolition in the 1840s. This is not a new idea. It actually goes back to ancient times. And then in the 1840s in America, we had Margaret Fuller and the Transcendental Club talking about gender as a spectrum and how if we want to get back to the one source of things and we want to be this human blob, this transhumanist blob, we have to abolish gender. And the first step to that is convincing women that they can be men and that men have to be feminine, and we have to have this gender equality and we're all just interchangeable widgets. So it's hard for people sometimes when they hear me just do a podcast like this and just lay all this stuff out. They get very overwhelmed and they're like, what? I don't get it. What are they trying to do? And it's mainly just, so the goals are depopulation, because the smaller the population is, the easier it is to control and the more resources there are for the elites. A lot of these people have very ancient ideas going back to like Pythagoras and the Sumerians and all this sort of thing about goddess worship, about gender abolition, monism, all these kind of ancient concepts that elites adopt and then use because they want to engineer and control society and control population.
They weaponize them.
Yes.
I would like to. I'd like to end on this. Do you believe that all of the little g gods are? And I don't know if you believe. I'm just asking. Are like fallen angels?
I do. I actually just wrote an academic paper, my first academic paper that I presented at a conference, talking about paganism and feminism and how the Bible says that the gods of the nations, gods little g, are demons. And in the book here, I just highlighted this part because I wanted to see what you thought of it specifically, Sam. In 1 Timothy 4, it says, "Now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with hot iron, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from meats, which God hath created to be received in thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth." So just in those two verses, you have abolition of marriage, free love, veganism, speaking lies and hypocrisy, and departing from the faith and giving heed to seducing spirits, which that's why you always see sexuality bound up with feminism. It always has to be sexual liberation. There are some feminists who think that's bad. You have the Andrea Dworkins who think that all sex is slavery and that crazy nonsense. But is always, because that's what women's power is, right? If we're going to use our power in a subversive, inverted kind of way, we're going to use our sexuality to seduce and control men, to manipulate, to get our way. And that's typically what you see, like goddess worship temples had temple prostitutes. I think
they were trans. Some of them were trans.
Oh, yeah, big time. They had eunuchs. They had little boys that were castrated. They had all this kind of deeply disturbing, inverted stuff. I don't think it's a coincidence that you now have OnlyFans, and like my two older daughters who are in their early 20s, they've had to talk multiple friends out of starting an OnlyFans. These girls turn 18 and it's the first thing they do is like, I got to start an OnlyFans. You never had that. Like, never before in history did you have this tool where almost every 18-year-old girl can now become a temple prostitute through the Black Mirror that
you
she holds in her hand.
Right on that.
Let's talk about, we've had 100 years of feminism being the, by the way, this is the default setting now. So we're like fish that swim in feminist water. We don't even realize that we're operating off of like a feminist programming. So I talk to women all the time about deprogramming this because I wasn't immune to it either. When I was young, I was just a normal girl operating off this feminist programming myself. And it's in all the Disney movies and it's in all the TV shows and all that stuff. But we've had 100 years of this now. And maybe there's women out there listening to this going, yeah, but think of all the ways that we might be better off with feminism now. And it's like, okay, well, let's look at all the metrics. Let's look at some statistics. So in 1960, 72% of all American adults were married. By 2016, that number dropped to 50%. And now I think it's even a little lower. Like the divorce rate is going down only because nobody's bothering to even get married anymore.
Right.
So that's one metric. We already talked about out of wedlock births going up by like a factor of 12 in just 50 years. In 2012, there was a really interesting study done on children who were admitted to psych wards in mental hospitals. And of all the children that they looked at, 89% of the kids who were admitted on a psych ward came from a disrupted family background, meaning they were not living with mom and dad married. It was some other situation. 89%. Then we look at 1/3 of all children now live in a home without their biological dad. And if you look at the statistics for kids who live without their father in their home, it's like 90% of homeless kids come from a fatherless home. 75% of kids who don't graduate high school. The vast majority, like 80-something% of kids who are in a substance abuse treatment center or like the mental health facility are going to have no dad at home. Every metric you look at for children, kids who are in juvie, same thing. Every time a kid ends up in a bad place as a child, the vast majority of the time, they do not have their dad at home living with them. And that wasn't normal until the last 40, 50 years. If you look at, this is another big one that I think you guys will like. So welfare spending. If you plot welfare spending on a graph, along with those out of wedlock births we talked about, they go up like this, just in perfect lockstep together, which is how I said I'm going to prove to you we've replaced fathers with the state. So in 1950, when the out of wedlock birth rate was 5%, we had $50 billion a year in welfare spending. Not good, but this is adjusted for inflation, okay? So $50 billion in welfare spending isn't good, but by 2010, only 50 years later, when the out of wedlock births jumped to 41%, we now have $700 billion a year in welfare spending. So it's a 14 times increase in both out of wedlock births and welfare spending. I know it's just a correlation, but it's a hell of a correlation if you ask me. So this was by design. And part of the reason for this, like why do these people, these elites who do this social engineering, why do they want to get rid of dads? Why do they want dads out of the picture? Multiple reasons. One is the Marxist feminists wrote at length about how private property is passed through the father. Men with no legacy, men with no kids aren't going to have a legacy. Their property is going to end up in the hands of the state. Their wealth is going to end up in the hands of the bankers.
Unbelievable, dude.
Yeah. And another big reason is if you're a predator, the best way to get to kids is through a mom who has no dad in the home, right? So if you want to get to kids as a predator, you look for single moms. You look for moms where the dad is out of the picture. He's been kicked out. She divorced him or something, or the dad was never in the home. So there's a lot of reasons, but it's all bad stuff. And dads and husbands are the primary protectors. I have a piece on my Substack I would love for everybody to go check out. It examines 45 years of data of what happens when we remove dads from the home. Because in the 70s, a big point of the feminist propaganda was to say that the primary danger to women and children is the dad, the husband, right? Your husband is a drunk and he's going to beat you. He's going to be controlling. He's going to abuse you. If you don't have your own money, if you don't have your own education, your husband's going to end up being an abusive drunk who hurts you and your children. And women really bought this. They really bought into this. That propaganda started with the Women's Temperance Union, which is a whole other story, but it really got pushed in the 70s. And what actually happens when you remove fathers from the picture is that every metric of abuse for women and children goes up. You are not safer living with your boyfriend. You are not safer living as a single mom. You are not safer getting rid of your husband because he's the person who has the most vested interest in protecting you and his biological offspring. And we have 45 years of data from all reporting agencies that report to the government on any type of abuse of women and children. And it's overwhelming. Like, I feel like if people knew this information, it would change the world. But it's just not out there because the feminist, propaganda machine is so incredible. It's just so strong.
And I
for second and subsequent marriages, the divorce rate gets higher and higher the more times you've been married. So no, and 26% of all adult American women are on at least one prescription psychiatric drug. And in my book, I also cite 2 major studies. This is in that Substack article too. They did a study in 2009 called The Paradox of Female Happiness, where they did like a massive survey of women in the West and found that to the extent that they were more liberated, the more miserable they were, which made me think to myself, liberated from what? We keep talking about women's liberation. Liberation from what? From motherhood, from your father who wants to love and protect you. Are there bad fathers? Yes. Are there bad husbands? Yes. But that is not the overall experience. That is not the general experience. In general, fathers want to protect their offspring. Husbands want to protect their wives. And by convincing women that husbands and fathers are the primary threat, it actually makes women more vulnerable to men who are predatory, who don't want to protect them. So, and then convincing them of this goddess worship stuff where you find your empowerment through sexuality. Girls, ladies out there, your sexual year, the years where you have this tremendous sexual power from maybe age 16 until 25, 30 years old. It's a temporary little period of your life where you're sitting on this magic thing that gets you pretty much whatever you want, especially if you're attractive, right? But it doesn't last. You have to think about that second half of your life. I'm 43 now, okay? It's like we see Hollywood women trying to be sexy at 70 and all this nonsense, and it's laughable. And it doesn't matter how much aborted fetus serum they rub on their face or, you know, how much plastic surgery they get. They start to look, number one, transgender. These women that get tons and tons of plastic surgery start to actually look trans or start to look like aliens or like you get that uncanny valley thing going. So no, you're not going to be sexy at 70 and you shouldn't be shooting for that. You should be using those years to get the best man you can and build and create a family. And then once you do that, if you want to do what I did and like write a book, be on a podcast and talk to some great people like Sam and his guys here, you can do that. There's a lot of life to live in the second half of your life, but you don't want to be Chelsea Handler and be eating edibles and sleeping in until 2 p.m. and trying to make funny videos
and
that nobody thinks is funny.
Everybody you're happy when it's so obvious.